If we talk about the mid-20th century, when the Cold War between the United States of America and the Soviet Union was at its peak, the center of global power unexpectedly shifted toward a tiny island nation located just miles away from the United States. In fact, during this period, a missile crisis involving this small country brought the world to the brink of a third world war. Cuba is surrounded by the United States and the Bahamas to the north, Mexico and Guatemala to the west. This archipelago consists of nearly 4,200 islands and is located between 19 degrees to 24 degrees north latitude and 74 degrees to 85 degrees west longitude, at the meeting point of the northern Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean. Cuba, the principal island of this archipelago, is surrounded by four smaller island groups: the Colorados Archipelago, the Sabana Camagüey Archipelago, the Jardines de la Reina Archipelago, and the Canarios Archipelago. If we talk about the main island of Cuba, it stretches nearly 1,250 kilometers in length and has a total land area of approximately 104,556 square kilometers. We are talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, before discussing that event, let us first understand Cuba's history. Before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the 15th century, Cuba was inhabited by two indigenous tribes, the Taíno and the Guanahatabey people. But after Columbus arrived, Cuba remained a Spanish colony from the 15th century until 1898. Later, following the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the Treaty of Paris signed between Spain and the United States, Cuba became a protectorate of the United States until 1902. Finally, on May 20th, 1902, Cuba formally gained independence from the United States, leading to the birth of the Republic of Cuba. However, in reality, Cuba still remained heavily influenced by the United States. The Cuban government, economic policies, and foreign relations were all deeply affected by direct American interference. Until the mid-1950s, Cuba largely served American economic and strategic interests. Under these circumstances, Cuban military officer Fulgencio Batista, with the support of the United States, carried out a military coup and overthrew the elected government. From 1952 to 1959, Batista ruled Cuba as a dictator. During his rule, corruption, oppression, and human rights violations reached extreme levels. As a result, by the mid-1950s, armed revolutionary movements against Batista's dictatorship had begun under the leadership of Fidel Castro. In 1958, Castro's 26th of July movement emerged as the leading revolutionary group. Backed by growing support, Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces captured the Cuban capital on January 8, 1959. Realizing that he had lost control, dictator Fulgencio Batista fled the country. Interestingly, in the beginning, Fidel Castro's rebellion and leaders like Che Guevara actually received indirect support from the United States because American relations with Batista had deteriorated over time. At that stage, the U.S. believed that regime change in Cuba would serve its own interests. However, contrary to American expectations, the new Cuban government legalized the Communist Party soon after taking power. In February 1960, Fidel Castro signed a commercial agreement with Soviet Vice Premier Anastas Mikoyan. At the same time, the Cuban government forcefully implemented agrarian reforms, ending the dominance of American landlords in Cuba. This further worsened relations between Cuba and the United States. In an attempt to regain control over Cuba and remove Castro from power, U.S. President John F. Kennedy approved a covert military operation known as the Bay of Pigs invasion on April 14, 1961. The purpose of this operation was to train and arm Cuban refugees so they could overthrow Castro's government. However, the operation failed miserably. The Cuban military crushed the invasion before it could succeed. Humiliated by this failure, the United States imposed severe economic and diplomatic sanctions on Cuba in 1962. And during the same year, in October and November 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world dangerously close to nuclear war. Now, before moving further into Cuba's story, let us briefly understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. As you may already know, after the Second World War, the world became divided into two major blocs. One was led by the United States and its allies, while the other was led by the Soviet Union. Since humanity had already witnessed two devastating world wars, both superpowers avoided direct military conflict. Instead, they fought proxy wars using diplomacy, intelligence agencies, and political influence. This period became known as the Cold War. During this time, both nations competed aggressively to expand their global influence and surpass each other through scientific and military advancements. To pressure the Soviet Union, the United States deployed nuclear missiles in allied countries close to Soviet territory, particularly Italy and Turkey. In response, after Castro established his government in Cuba, the Soviet Union found a powerful new ally near American territory. To counter the United States in the same way, the USSR deployed ballistic missiles in Cuba. This intense nuclear confrontation became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fortunately, by December 1962, the crisis was peacefully resolved. However, by then, Cuba had officially emerged as a close ally of the Soviet Union. In 1963, Cuba moved even closer to the USSR by fully adopting a communist political and economic system. Even today, Cuba remains one of the few countries that still largely follows a full-fledged communist model. Before the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban economy was dominated by American companies. Nearly 80% of Cuba's trade depended on U.S. businesses. Public utilities, railroads, and oil refineries were controlled by American firms. More than half of Cuba's agricultural land was owned by U.S. corporations and developers. In many ways, Cuba was completely dependent on the United States for its economy and daily functioning. After the revolution, however, Cuba became heavily dependent on Soviet aid and Soviet-controlled markets until the late 1980s. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba suddenly lost these subsidies, pushing the country into a severe economic depression. Between 1990 and 1993, Cuba's GDP fell by more than 33%. This economic crisis is known in world economic history as the Special Period. To recover from this collapse, Cuba adopted limited free market reforms in order to reduce shortages of food, consumer goods, and services. Some retail and light manufacturing sectors were removed from direct government control to encourage self-employment. The use of the US dollar in business transactions was legalized, and Cuba began heavily promoting tourism to boost its economy and foreign exchange reserves. At the same time, after Soviet food imports stopped, Cuba developed a unique farming system called organoponics. Despite these reforms, Cuba's economy still clearly follows socialist principles. It remains largely a state-controlled, planned economy where most means of production are owned by the government.